All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second session in our East Asia and the Upper Midwest teacher program for this year on the topic of Frank Lloyd Wright and Japanese art. Thank you for all of you who attended last week's session. Thank you for all of those also who sent feedback. It was really great to hear what you're learning and what you got out of that session. I know that this session is going to be another great conversation. So we are joined today in this session with Dr. James Nguyen, who is the Van Vleck Curator of Works on Paper at the Chazen Museum of Art at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He completed his MA in Art History at the University of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota, and his PhD in Art History at Case Western Reserve University. Previously, James has held positions as the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation Predoctoral Curatorial Fellow in the Department of Prints and Drawings at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and as the Margaret R. Mainwaring Curatorial Fellow of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. His articles about printmaking and its history have appeared in Print Quarterly and Art in Print. And James, we are so delighted to have you here today, and thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this.
Thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm excited about this opportunity to collaborate with the Center for East Asian Studies and the Chazen Museum of Art here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and kind of share this real special collection that we have here at the museum that was once owned by Frank Lloyd Wright, and that is a group of his Japanese prints. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about my job here at the Chazen Museum of Art. I am the curator of works on paper, and that means I'm responsible for the care, preservation, and to some extent the interpretation of all of the prints, drawings, and photographs here in our museum. That is for all geographies and all time periods, and does include our extensive collection of Japanese prints. My area of academic expertise is not Japanese prints, but rather early European printmaking, specifically from Germany and specifically engraving. So I just wanted to start by saying I am not an expert in Japanese prints, though I am actively studying them regularly and learning as I must due to my responsibility for the collection here. I'm also not an expertise I do not have expertise in architecture, nor necessarily in-depth knowledge about Frank Lloyd Wright. And so the intersections of those are not something I can necessarily speak about without introducing supposition. And so I will do my best to answer questions, but some things that are specific to the curriculum might be better suited for Dr. Newt. I just wanted to mention that. So my focus today will be on Japanese prints, a little bit about their history, how they're created, the methods and materials used to produce them. And then I wanted to tell you about the collection of Japanese prints here at the Chazen that were previously owned by Frank Lloyd Wright, how he was an influential Japanese print collector and dealer, and his role in the development of the Japanese print market in the early 20th century in the United States. And then also share with you some resources that we can make available from the Chazen Museum of Art for you to use as you develop your curricula related to the topic of Frank Lloyd Wright and the art of Japan. Okay, so with that said, I'll share my screen. And if someone, David, would you let me know when you see my PowerPoint presentation?
I see it, James.
Okay, excellent. So my topic today, Frank Lloyd Wright and Japanese color woodcuts. I think we'll start learning a little bit about the woodcut printing technique. And let me just see if, okay, there we go, good. Okay, woodcut is a printing technique in which a carved block of wood functions like a stamp to replicate an image in large numbers. The wood block you see on the left here printed the image of a Japanese woman on the right. When preparing a wood block for printing, a woodcarver uses chisels, gouges, knives, or other tools to remove the negative space of the image, and what remains in relief, like the lines that form the image of the woman in this example, is what carries the ink to the paper. For this reason, the woodcut technique fits into a broader category known as relief printing. Ink is applied to the block's raised surfaces, and the block is pressed against paper. The pressure necessary to transfer the image from a block may be applied by hand, by firmly pressing on the back of the sheet of paper, or by using a printing press. And you can notice here in this example where the wood carver has cut away the surface of this block around the lines that form the image. And whoever printed the block rolled or dabbed then black ink onto these raised lines in order to print them. And notice also that the finished print mirrors or reverses the image initially carved into the block. And this is an aspect of printmaking that in many, though not all, printing techniques, but certainly in woodcut, the matrix, which is a word that we use to describe the wood block, is, when printed, reversed in the final image. A woodblock may generate hundreds of impressions that are typically called woodcuts to signify the method by which they're made. And sometimes you will see Japanese prints referred to as color woodblock prints, and that would be another group of terms or words that describe Japanese color woodcuts. So a little bit about the history of woodblock printing. The origins of woodblock printing are obscured by a lack of surviving evidence, but very likely began in ancient times in East Asia as a way to print on textiles. Woodcuts printed on paper developed in China at least by the 8th century. Now more than 1,000 years old, surviving examples of early Chinese woodcuts are scarce. This composite sheet from the 10th century presents multiple images of Avalokitesvara, Buddhist Bodhisattva of compassion, all printed from the same block. And this example is now part of the British Museum's collection, along with several other Chinese woodcuts from the same period. And I think this is the only print in this presentation that is not part of the Chazen's collection. But I did want to acknowledge that the origins of the woodcut are not necessarily are not from Japan, nor are they from Europe, but China. Okay, in Japan, woodblock printing developed in conjunction with book and album production. With the rise of an urban middle class of artisans and merchants in the 17th century, a group that had some economic power, grew an interest in book and albums, and books and printed images. Initially, the printed images, which came to be known as ukiyo-e, meaning floating world pictures or pictures of the floating world, used only black ink or were hand colored. And here you're looking at an example from the 17th century by Hishikawa Moronobu. And he is an artist that is really sometimes considered a founder of ukiyo-e, even though there was printing of images prior to his work. He did such a large volume of books and illustrations and albums that he has been given credit for really being a founder of the medium. And here is a work by one of his students, Hishikawa Moronobu. And this is an example also printed with black ink, but with hand-applied color. And the earliest Japanese prints that did have color, that color would have been hand-applied. Around 1745, techniques evolved that allowed printmakers to efficiently add color with wood blocks rather than applying those by hand. And here we have an example by Katsukawa Shunsho, and it is an example of an actor print. One of the subjects that were that was very popular in ukiyo-e were related to the theater and actors playing particular roles. And as I mentioned earlier, that the development of this form of art, ukiyo-e, coincided with this growing urban middle class, and therefore tended to reflect the popular interests of that group as well, including kabuki theater and other forms of entertainment. And this is the actor Ichikawa Danjuro V as a samurai in a wrestling arena. And the other thing I should mention is that all of the prints I'm showing you, I think with maybe one or two exceptions, were formerly owned by Frank Lloyd Wright. And so this is an example of a print that Frank Lloyd Wright at one time had in his collection. Okay, now I wanted to take a few moments to talk to you about how the multiple blocks are used to produce the multicolored images in ukiyo-e. This is an example by Tomiki Chiro. I always struggle with this one, the pronunciation of this 20th century printmaker's name. And it shows the Kameyama Shrine in Kishu. It's from a series of scenes of sacred and historic places. And we have an example of this print in the Chazen's collection. And this is an example that was not part of Frank Lloyd Wright's collection. But we also have, as part of this collection, oops, one too many. Sorry, I have to back up here. We also have the wood blocks that were used to print this image. So we have 5 wood blocks. Here you're seeing 5 different cuttings of those blocks to print particular elements within the image. But these are only 5 of the cuttings. The other side of each of these blocks have another cutting. And so the printmakers efficiently used both sides of the piece of wood to create the various elements necessary to print the complete image. So if we look at this one closely, what you can see here is that this was created to print the sky. So the relief area, the part that stands out from the rest of the block, is what printed the sky. And you can see here that sky is printed with a gradation from a light gray at the top to a darker gray towards the bottom. And we can see a little bit of the residue of the ink that created that gradation, which would have been done perhaps by applying ink carefully with a brush, or perhaps adding some water to kind of create the washes and make sure that that ink went from the one shade of gray to the other. So very painstaking process to carefully ink that block. But we can see that the printmaker needed to leave the white space available for this, this gate and some of the other elements, like the top of the buildings, that needed to not be gray. So that was actually cut away so that it would not print those particular shapes, and that then within that, another block could add in the colors appropriate for those particular forms. And I should mention too that we often think of the artists, that the prints were made by a particular artist, and that is true to an extent, but the artist really created the design, the original drawing, and conceived perhaps of the coloration, the scheme in which that completed image would be printed. But it really involved a host of players, participants in that process. There was a publisher, as well as the block cutters and the printers. So in some ways, it was not just the artist who created that work, but a workshop and a crew of many laborers. In this example here, we can see the moon was in relief. And then here are some other areas of relief that printed the grays in these pointed buildings. We also have a little bit of this blue-gray that printed this textile that's hanging on this building as well. And here, in this case, we have the red that was printed on this element here, as well as the black darkest forms for this pillar. And then I like this block quite a lot because we can see actually the process a bit about how the image was transferred from block to block. So initially, the artist would draw the full composition with lines, and that would be pasted down onto the first block. And then the artists, or I'm sorry, the woodcutters would cut away around those lines so that that image could be printed. And they'd print a few of those with just the black lines. And then those images would be pasted down on the subsequent blocks. And then the specific elements could be isolated. And then the woodcutters would just leave in relief those elements that that particular block would apply in the varying colors. And so here we can see that the whole image was at once pasted onto this block, and we see a little trace of where that printed paper was laid down. Much of it has been torn away. Obviously, the woodcutters cut out the area around this pillar, but we do see a little bit left on the block. And so this is a good example of a way that we can see the process in the materials that are extant. And here on this block, I wanted to point out that at the very bottom, there are some marks. They're called kento, and there's one here in the lower right corner. It's kind of making the corner at a right angle, and then there's a single line here at the bottom of the page. And these are registration marks. These were put into the original drawing, the original print, and then transferred to each of these blocks along with that paper. And then the woodcutter would cut these so that when it was time to run the print, they would be able to align the sheet of paper perfectly against each block. And that way, all of the colors and all of the elements would line up correctly. And so these are kento, the registration guides that are cut into each block to aid in the alignment of paper. I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of the process and the complexity that goes into creating this. And I think it's interesting to consider in light of architecture, because just as an architect designs the building, but then there have to be a number of people involved in kind of rendering those plans, sourcing the materials, figuring out how to complete the architect's conception. Something similar happens with complex woodcuts created in the Japanese color print tradition. And here's the completed print one more time. Okay, Frank Lloyd Wright and Japanese prints. Frank Lloyd Wright was keenly interested in Japanese art, which he collected and used to decorate his homes. He was an active dealer of Japanese art from the time of his first trip to Japan in 1905 until around 1922. He was especially attracted to Japanese prints, which he bought cheaply in Japan and sold to his clients in the United States. As a result, he played a major role in popularizing Japanese print collecting in this country. Wright himself said that Japanese prints contributed to his life in many ways for over 60 years. According to Julia Meach, a historian who wrote the book Frank Lloyd Wright and the Art of Japan, there was a time when Wright's career as a Japanese print dealer rivaled his work as an architect in terms of his attention and financial gain. And to some extent, the added income from print sales helped Wright sustain himself as a visionary architect. Today, one can trace thousands of ukiyo-e that Frank Lloyd Wright collected or sold in museums like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which bought directly from Wright at the time, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Dallas Art Museum, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, the Minneapolis Museum of Art, and the Chazen Museum of Art here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I was wrong. It is the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. I was correct when I said it the first time. The Chazen has about 2,800 Japanese woodcuts previously owned by Wright. And so our collection here is one of, if not the largest groups of Wright's Japanese prints that survive together. And for those of us in Wisconsin, this is especially meaningful because Wright was born in Wisconsin and spent 2 semesters as a student in the School of Engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he also developed Taliesin, the large estate with his home, studio, and school. That's about 45 miles west of Madison near Spring Green and the Wisconsin River. As I mentioned, Wright made his first trip to Japan in 1905. He went with his wife, Catherine, and Mr. and Mrs. Ward Willets, for whom he designed one of his first prairie houses in 1902. And Wright returned with several hundred woodcuts. He was especially fond of the Japanese printmaker Uragawa Hiroshige, who lived from 1797 until 1858, shortly before Wright was born. Wright organized the first retrospective exhibition of Hiroshige's prints. And that's a, oh, this is, okay, sorry. Here it is. This is the image of the first retrospective exhibition of Hiroshige's prints that Wright organized in 1906 at the Art Institute of Chicago. And this was also the first time that museum had displayed ukiyo-e at all, ever. And perhaps by design, it's worth noting that Wright's Hiroshige exhibition coincided with the museum's 19th annual exhibition of the Chicago Architectural Club. So it's very notable that Frank Lloyd Wright acquired a great number of these prints by Uragawa Hiroshige, brought them to Chicago, and then created these this very early exhibition of ukiyo-e at the Art Institute of Chicago, just as interest was starting to grow in this form of art in the United States, and then featuring Uragawa Hiroshige in his first retrospective worldwide. 2 years later, Wright was a major lender to a large exhibition of ukiyo-e at the Art Institute of Chicago. And here is a picture of that exhibition. And it's important to note that not only did he lend to this exhibition, but he designed the installation. And I think if you look closely, you'll see that this architecture is in a line with some of his styles, as well as these stands that are here along this entryway. Here's another view of that exhibition from 1908, again, designed in terms of installation by Frank Lloyd Wright. So he's really thinking not only about introducing these prints to the public in the United States, but thinking of a way in which to display them that is unique and in line with his own ideas of interior design. And that speaks, I'm going to jump back a couple of slides because I also wanted to point out that here, I had mentioned that he sells his prints that he brings from Japan to his clients. This is the South Room of the Martin House in Buffalo, New York in 1908. And if you look closely, you can see in this South Room, here is a Japanese pillar print of a Japanese woman. There are other Japanese prints. It's very hard to see, but they are placed throughout the room. So he's bringing these works to the United States and selling them or lending them to his clients to use to help decorate the homes that he's designing for them. And this is the home of Darwin and Isabel Martin. And so this room, as I mentioned, had the pillar print. It also had birds and flower images, landscapes from a series of views along the Tokaido Road. So he's integrating into his interior design Japanese prints as an additional form of decoration. Okay, now I'm going to jump forward again. And as I mentioned, he's thinking about how to display Japanese prints. He even developed his own print stand. You see an example of this. Not many are extant. I think there was maybe one in a private collection, where he employs a design similar to that in his early prairie home chairs, these long, straight back chairs. But he develops them such that he can fit the various standard sizes of prints into them and use them decoratively. And here on the left, you see an exhibition of Wright's work at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1914. And you see a number of these stands of various sizes. Some could go on a table, some looked like they could stand on the floor, but all created to accommodate the prints within his home. And he did, well, to use in exhibitions, or also he used them in his home, or, and in this case, it's alongside his work that's on display at the Art Institute of Chicago, including a preliminary drawing for his Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. And I like this picture a lot because it's hard to see what the images are, the prints are in these special stands, but here is one that we can see. And on the right here is a print by Uragawa Hiroshige from the 100 Views of Famous Places in Edo. And that's in our collection and previously owned by Wright. But an important point to make. I can tell that that is the print that is in that print stand, but I can't be sure that it's exactly this impression. So keeping in mind that prints are multiples. And so we don't necessarily have the ability to always trace exactly which piece of paper with that particular image appeared in some of these photographs. But I do like knowing that this at least indicates that he liked this print or was interested in it enough to feature it in this installation at the Art Institute of Chicago. As I mentioned, he sold prints to many clients, including some wealthy collectors in Boston, William and John Spalding, and that is how some prints that he owned made their way into the Boston Art Museum. He did sell directly to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And he also sold this print to Edward Burr von Vleck, a mathematics professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Van Vleck purchased this print by Kitagawa Udamaro from Wright for $150 in 1926 during a visit he and his wife made at Taliesin, which I don't know like what that would be equivalent dollars today, but it seemed like quite a bit of money for 1926. I'm not sure exactly if that would have been particularly expensive or not, but it might be something interesting to try to find out. Certainly at that time, interest in Japanese prints was driving up prices, and there was a growing market. And as more and more people became interested and more people with wealth wanted to collect them, the prices did increase. And although Wright had some success dealing in Japanese prints, they were also at the heart of his financial difficulties. There was an incident around 1920, and his reputation as a dealer was damaged due to a scandal involving revamped prints. And these are prints in which the colors had perhaps faded in the original printing, but someone had carefully reprinted those colors to brighten them up. And there were also some prints that were not the originals, but had been remade or recreated or replicated. And he acquired some groups of prints in Japan and wasn't aware that these replicas or revamped kind of freshened prints were in the group. And then he passed them on to some of his clients who purchased them. And then as they studied them or showed them to other experts of Japanese prints, it became clear that they had been revamped or refreshed. And then so Frank Lloyd Wright's reputation was tarnished for that reason. He also had expensive tastes. and tended to live beyond his means to an extent. In fact, there's an anecdote in Julia Meach's book that I think is insightful. The architect's cousin, Richard Lloyd Jones, told a story about Wright showing up at his New York office seeking money for train fare home to Chicago. And Richard gave Wright the money, but an hour later, Wright was back in the office. He had just purchased a Japanese print, which he was happy to show his cousin, but then he needed train fare. so I think that's kind of an interesting insight into the way that Frank Lloyd Wright was so attracted to Japanese prints, he might not think about the longer term financial needs. On more than one occasion, Wright used Japanese prints as collateral for loans. Darwin Dennis Martin in Buffalo and Francis and Mary Trimble Little in Minneapolis were clients for whom Wright had designed homes, and the architect gave them groups of prints in order to guarantee personal loans to him. Around 1926, the Bank of Wisconsin took possession of more than 5,000 prints that Wright estimated to be worth about $40,000. And this is why, in a roundabout way, the Chazen Museum of Art now has so many prints that Wright once collected. In 1928, in order to make back some of the losses from Wright's delinquent loan, the bank sold approximately 4,000 of those prints to Edward Burr von Vleck, who was a Japanese print collector here in Madison. And he purchased those prints for about $4,000, and that's about $1 per print, and Wright was absolutely outraged. Van Vleck continued collecting Japanese prints himself until around 1941. He sold off some of Wright's prints that he had acquired, gave others away. But when he died, he left his Japanese print collection to his son, John Hasbrouck van Vleck, who was a mathematician and physicist. John van Vleck was also the co-recipient of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1977 for his contributions to the understanding of the behavior of electrons in magnetic solids. So I think it's interesting to think about Edward Burr von Vleck and his son John as being mathematicians and scientists, but also really interested in Japanese prints and art. And so this might be a way to think about who are collectors and what can someone who might be very entrenched in one kind of knowledge bring to or consider how they might have an interest in art. Perhaps in conjunction with developing a curriculum, thinking about what does it mean to collect and why do people collect? In the 1980s, John and his widow bequeathed nearly 4,000 Japanese prints to the Elvia Museum of Art, which is now called the Chazen Museum of Art. And as a result, the Chazen has, as I said, nearly 4,000, it's like 3,800 some prints, previously owned by Frank Lloyd Wright. 1,700 of those, more than 1,700 are by Hiroshige, and Hiroshige prints that Wright once owned. And there are also portraits of kabuki actors, sumo wrestlers that Wright collected, as well as, of course, landscapes, views of Japanese buildings, and other works by many different printmakers. And I wanted to show you a few. Here is another example from the 100 Views of Famous Places in Edo by Uragawa Hiroshige. This is interior of a restaurant by Uragawa Kunisada. This 3-panel design by Uragawa Kunisada depicts a detailed interior of a high-class restaurant. We can see the gardens and the continuous veranda that surround the restaurant. There are a variety of activities taking place. There's a couple of male guests in the lower center preparing to smoke pipes while they have a conversation. There are some black cases over here that are holding probably stringed instruments, suggesting a musical performance may soon take place. And if we think about Dr. Newt's curriculum, this print reminds me of Edward Morse's and Frank Lloyd Wright's interest in the relationship of Japanese dwellings and their adjacent gardens. With the shoji, the sliding doors withdrawn, the interior space and the garden flow one into the other. So I find this particularly interesting in light that Frank Lloyd Wright once owned this. Here is a print depicting frogs and some flowers. This is a type of print that Uragawa Hiroshige created, often with flowers and birds, but there are a few examples where there are other animals. A really charming print, I think. Also, I wanted to show you a print in the fan format. This is a print that could be cut out from the sheet. It was in the shape of a fan and could be glued onto a bamboo fan structure and used as a fan. This particular scene is from a play, a kabuki play, Imoseyama Ona Taiken, or Precepts of Noble Women of Mount Imo and Mount Sei. And it involves a pair of lovers, a samurai, Koganosuke, and the young woman, Hinadori. They're separated by a river and some other things like the fact that their families are rivals. But this is a scene that was popular in a kabuki play, and Hiroshige has kind of reimagined it in a landscape and in the fan format. Also among the holdings of Wright Prints is the Chazen's impression of Behind the Wave off Kanagawa from the series 36 Views of Mount Fuji. It's also known as the Great Wave, and this print by Katsushika Hokusai is arguably one of the most widely recognized works of art in the world. And it's nice to know that this particular one was owned by Frank Lloyd Wright. This color woodcut is one of my favorites. It's by Uragawa Hiroshige as well. It depicts Hakone Pass and Ashinoko Lake along the Tokaido. The Tokaido was a historic route connecting Edo, or present-day Tokyo, with Kyoto. The print is from a series of 53 views of the Tokaido created by Hiroshige after he himself traveled the road for the first time in 1832. And you can see down here, it's a little tricky to see them, but there are two travelers. They're wearing blue coats and kind of yellow hats, and they have stopped along the rocky path to look at the magnificent landscape. And this is a good example of a print made with carefully printed color fades. You see, like, through this rocky green area, it fades from a darker green to a lighter green. We see going from a blue into a blue-green to the green. That's a really well printed work. And it also reminds me that color woodcuts were a workshop production involving a team of skilled carvers and printers who translated that artist's drawing, original design into the printed form. Okay. The last thing I want to do is share with you some resources that are available through the Chazen Museum of Art. And the first thing I think I'll do is point out to you, there's a folder that David has sent a link to you. And it includes a number of higher resolution images that you could use in conjunction with your curricula if you wanted to get a closer look. In a moment, I'll show you how you can find Japanese prints on the Chazen's website, but many of those images are fairly low res and not so easy to see the details. So these are all images that you are welcome to download and use for scholarly purposes only. I ask that you do limit it to, they're not copyrighted, they're too old for that. So they're public domain images, but I do ask that you use them for scholarly use. It's one of the Chazen's policies. Also in this folder are a few PDFs. There's one that has a checklist for the high resolution images. So that would give you all of the artist information, their life dates, the title of the work, as well as an accession number. And what you'll find is that the woodcut images in this folder all have a number, like 1980 32 16, and that's the accession number or the inventory number that the Chazen uses. You could use that to correlate to the particular work. Maybe I can click on this and see what happens if it opens. Fingers crossed it actually opened. It did. Okay, so you can see that in this list, it always starts with the accession number. Here's the restaurant, for example, and then the artist name, title, etc. Okay, another thing that's in here is the same sort of a checklist. And it is a checklist of works that are going to be on view, all owned by Frank Lloyd Wright, and put on view here at the Chazen Museum of Art. They will go on view, I believe, this Tuesday, tomorrow, or soon. I forget which Tuesday the installation team told me, but a Tuesday in the very near future. And they will be on view through the end of 2021. So if you are in the Madison area, or you might be passing through, feel free to stop by the Chazen and look at the actual printed works themselves in our Asian galleries. And so you would be welcome to send students if you're in the local area, or come as a class as well. So that is something else we've made available, is a selection of works previously owned by Frank Lloyd Wright on view. Again, that's from the beginning of July. So I guess it would be next week. So next Tuesday, a week from tomorrow, through the end of year, December 2021. Well, the other thing I wanted to say about that is I went through Dr. Newt's curriculum, and I found examples of all of the illustrated Japanese prints that we have in our collection that were owned by Frank Lloyd Wright. So there will be a correlation between what you see on the walls and what appears in the curriculum, plus a few others like the Great Wave, that mountain alongside the lake at Hakone, and a few others like the fan that I showed you as well. Okay, and the last thing I want to do is to show you how you could find Japanese prints in general, but also prints that were previously owned by Frank Lloyd Wright in the Chazen's collection. And so if you come to chazen.wisc.edu at the homepage for the Chazen, and click on the collection, and you'll come to a page where you could search for titles or artists of all sorts and find art of various types. But what you'd want to do is scroll down until you see this filter by on the left side. Click on find notable collection, click on that drop down, and scroll down until you see E.B. Van Vleck collection of Japanese prints, because it's Edward Burr Van Vleck collection. That comprises, well, everything that Van Vleck had, but also includes the works by Frank Lloyd Wright. And if you click on that, you'll get 3,690 results. About 3 out of 4 of these will have previously been owned by Frank Lloyd Wright, including the Wave, the Great Wave. If you click on a work, it will open up, it'll show you a larger image, it'll give you basic information about it. And if you scroll down to related provenance and click on provenance, you can look to see, was this once owned by Frank Lloyd Wright? And here it says, by 1925, purchased in Japan by Frank Lloyd Wright, circa 1926, acquired by the Bank of Wisconsin, sold to Edward Burr Van Vleck. You get the whole story kind of in a sentence. And so that is one way, if, for example, you wanted to find other examples besides those that I've shared with you that were owned by Frank Lloyd Wright, or give students an assignment to find a work on our website, do some research to find a work by a Japanese artist that was previously owned by Frank Lloyd Wright, that would be a tool you could give them, or an assignment you could give them. And I just go back to this folder, and there is a document here, how to locate Frank Lloyd Wright Japanese prints on the CMA website. It will walk you through step by step what I've just showed you. and that is there. Also, I've been asked to point out to you the fair use of images for teaching, research, etc. That's Chazen policy, and so I'll reiterate that we ask that you use any images that you find in this folder or on our website for research and scholarly use only. And that is everything that I wanted to share with you during my talk today. And this time I'm happy to turn it back over to David to facilitate questions.
All right, James, thank you very much for that really interesting explanation of the printmaking process, of how the Chazen came to own so many of Frank Lloyd Wright's works, and how we can find them and locate them. And I am very excited to go to the Chazen sometime in the next couple of weeks and see some of these myself. That is a really great opportunity, and I hope many of the people who are participating in this who live within a reasonable distance from Madison can maybe find an opportunity to see some of these works for themselves. While you were talking, James, we got some questions into the chat. So I think I'll just go to some of those in the chat right now, but I encourage you, if you have a question for James, we'll answer a few from the chat. Either type it into the chat or use the reactions button to raise your hand, or I will. That's probably the best way. I can jump to gallery view occasionally to see if anyone's waving their hand vigorously, but probably put it in the chat or raise your hand, and we'd be happy to take questions for the time that we have left. So James, the first question in the chat was, and we will also go to some of your submitted questions as time allows. So James, Teresa asked, do you have any pictures of the tools that were used? And do you know if these tools have changed much with the passage of time?
I don't have any pictures of the tools, not with me. And I don't know the answer to that question about have they changed over time. I tend to doubt it, but that would be a supposition on my part.
All right.
But that's a good question.
Yeah.
How have those tools evolved?
And I should say, we also had a question of how many blocks did that image take, but I think you explained that very well. Yeah, and if I counted, it was 10. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it would have, well, there were 5 blocks, but each block used on each side. So 10 different components, if you will, or 10 different impressions, right, from those blocks onto the sheet of paper. I haven't systematically, and this would take a little bit of time because it's a very complex print, to go through and say, look at the print next to the block and like kind of do an inventory of every single element and every single color and shade of color in the print, and then correlate that to a block. My assumption is, I even went through the file for that object today to see if somewhere it says these are all of the blocks for this print, and I think it probably is, but so it would be 10.
All right, and we have another question here. What wood did they tend to use? It seems to have been a very fine grain.
Right, they tended mostly to use cherry and sometimes boxwood, maybe other things. And some of that might depend to a degree on how high-end or refined that image was going to be, right? So that using a really fine hardwood that would like really provide the ability to carve very intricate fine lines would maybe be important for certain works, and maybe if you wanted to do something a little more cost effective, you could use other woods, but it was mostly cherry and sometimes boxwood.
All right, and I thought your explanation of that, James, was just really wonderful, and it really helped me understand that these prints were a production. Because I was thinking about the skills of involved, the drawing skills, but then the skills of transferring it on and making sure everything lined up, and the idea that one person could do all that, although I'm sure there are people who can, was really mind-boggling to me. And to know that, well, there was a division of labor there was really helpful.
And someone bankrolling it, right? So there's the publisher as well. Who's coordinating it, who's paying the artist for the image, but also like hiring and making sure that the production happens and all the workers involved.
All right, we have another question from Teresa. To increase the value of the prints, and ensure that there could be no more exact replicas made, did buyers ever ask to purchase the physical blocks themselves?
That is a great question. Certainly, we know that the early centuries of Japanese printing, as in Europe, the printmakers, this was a popular art form. The goal was to efficiently replicate images and sell them. And the more you could print and sell, the more money you could make. And the publisher or whomever put the funding up for that would own those matrices, and they would reuse them and reuse them and reuse them. And sometimes a block would wear out, but that was if it was a popular image, they would just like recreate that block. And so within the study of Japanese prints, for example, there are scholars who are looking at every single impression they can find of a particular image and comparing them and comparing the colors and like, does the block crack or does something break? Does it change? And kind of sorting out as best they can, like the history of that print. And so even though it's multiple, it's not only multiple, but it could have multiple iterations or multiple editions. But to answer the question, would someone try to acquire those blocks? I think that would be proprietary. I don't know, like especially historically, I don't think that the publisher would let that out of their hands. That's the way of producing the product that they could sell and earn money. I don't know of a specific example. We have these blocks, right? So this is we have the blocks, and this is a 20th century artist. At some point, maybe a dealer acquired that. Maybe, I don't know the provenance of those or how those came from the artist's hands to be at the Chazen, but I can say that the Chazen acquired them and from a dealer and for didactic purposes, so that we could do exactly what we've done today, which is to help illustrate that process. And we have those not because we want to ensure no one ever prints it again, which we wouldn't want to do anyway. But I don't think historically that would be the case. Now, sometimes there would be a patron who would, do a private commission, like they would have enough money, they wanted a special publication, and they would fund it. I don't know. It's a good question. Like, would they own the blocks then as well? I would guess whoever put up the money would own those.
And while we're speaking of value, James, while you were giving the values of the different prints that were sold to Van Vleck, I went over to the Government's Bureau of Labor Statistics, a site I used quite often for other research. And so $150 that Van Vleck would have paid would have been $2,100 in 2021. And according to what you said of Wright's value of his collection would have been over $600,000, I believe, in 1928. And so then Van Vleck would have paid about $60,000 for that entire collection. So definitely got it for a song if Wright's valuation was anything like accurate.
Which I don't know. I think there's some question. He might have, been optimistic.
He seemed to live a rather optimistic life.
Actually, let me just take a moment to show you this book, because this is a book that's not in print. It's not easy to get, but this is the book by Julia Meach. And just in full disclosure, a lot of what I told you today is coming out of this book, Frank Lloyd Wright and the Art of Japan. I think it's cited in Dr. Newt's curriculum as well. But if you want the nitty gritty details of his marriages and what happened here and there and all of the financial strife and how prints and Japanese art kind of play into that narrative, that's the book that you can dig into.
Thank you for that, James. And that is one of the titles that we wanted to purchase, and it was out of print, as well as Dr. Newt's book entitled Frank Lloyd Wright in Japanese Art. So when that's always a struggle when we're dealing with these programs, is there's some really excellent work out there, but if it's not in print, it's really impossible for us to get enough copies for everyone. But yeah, thank you for pointing that out.
The library.
Yes. Oh, we have another question here from Naya Gibson. How many prints did Frank Lloyd Wright actually acquire throughout all his life? Do you know how many passed through his hands?
I do not. I do not. And I haven't seen any estimates either.
Okay.
You know, he went to Japan multiple times and he'd buy bundles of them. But I don't know that anyone has been able to completely sort that out. Or I don't know if it would be possible, and I don't know that anyone has done it.
And
but it was more than we have, certainly.
yeah. And I'm assuming he was buying low and selling high. Is that your understanding?
That was part of his strategy, right? Yeah, buy low, sell high. He was hoping that, especially as he wasn't the only influential dealer of Japanese prints in the United States. There's a community or a network of these dealers who were operating in the United States and all promoting Japanese prints. And Dr. Newt's curriculum kind of goes into a lot of that, growing interest and the shift from sort of maybe a negative attitude towards Japanese architecture, for example, to one that was celebrating it. And that, is happening, and alongside that are the introduction of these prints into a market in the United States. And so I think Frank Lloyd Wright really saw that boom and interest as an opportunity. He wasn't always able to effectively capitalize on it.
And then we just have a comment here from Kathleen Henderson. I have done the process in linoleum and it is tricky without even involving the wood grain. And I know just looking at the process, it just, as someone who has a difficulty just drawing on paper, drawing something reverse on 10 blocks and then putting them all together just makes my head hurt a little bit. It really is astounding. We have another question here. Was printmaking process technique passed down through the family similar to katana making and the samurai? Katana being, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the type of swords that samurai would use.
I'm going to suppose a little bit here. I think that there is the probability that did happen. Certainly these workshops involve many people, and I get the sense too that someone might not be a direct descendant, but become an apprentice or become a part of that workshop and excel. And so one thing we do see is that there are these schools. So Uragawa, we have Uragawa Hiroshige is like one of the leaders of this school. And then there are many Uragawa printmakers, and they have a different name, but they're Uragawa, a different other name, but they are of the Uragawa, and that tends to like pass down. And you might even have printmakers with the same name, but there's the first and the second, and I don't know if it's like hereditary by blood or if it's more hereditary by becoming a part of the workshop under that master, and like kind of then taking on that that workshop or that kind of entity or identity as a printmaker.
Thank you.
There's one other book that I'll show you, and this will be really hard to get, or if you find it, it'll be super expensive. But fortunately, the Chazen has this so that I can use it, and it is the Hotai Encyclopedia of Japanese Prints. I don't know if I can get it. It's 2 volumes into the screen, but the Hotai Encyclopedia of Japanese Woodblock Prints. And this has a lot of answers to the questions you are posing about the production and the materials and how did they do this. And then there's a whole section just on the names of the various printmakers with little short bios. And so, as I said at the beginning, I'm not an expert on this. I haven't digested all of the knowledge in English on it, but I use these resources to answer the same sorts of good questions you're raising.
Thank you. Thank you for that, James, and for the additional resources. Kathleen Henderson asks, have there been instances of Japan trying to get these prints returned, or any of these prints returned? And I guess I just wonder too, if you have any idea of, are these prints valued in Japan today? Would you see these in a Japanese museum, or is it kind of their history in the United States that makes them so valuable?
There are collections of ukiyo-e, of Japanese prints in Japan and archived there. I have not heard of any attempts to repatriate anything in particular. They largely came out of the country at a time when they were still recognized as a popular, form of popular art, popular culture, not necessarily as the fine art that the Western cultures kind of recognized and kind of elevated it to that particular status. I have not heard of a particular case of wanting something back. Now, that said, I wouldn't be surprised if there are things they would rather didn't leave at this point, but I haven't heard of anything. So, for example, like this isn't Japanese, but I don't believe that the Mona Lisa will leave France, right? To be loaned to any institution. Like that is a national treasure. I don't know that, I can't say whether Japan sees any examples of Japanese prints as particular national treasures or examples of them. But again, these are multiples.
Yeah.
So if we have, some Hiroshige here, they probably got them there as well. So it's not quite the same as this like super unique, priceless object.
And we had a question that just also came in and it says, was this art as popular in other places, such as Europe, etc., as it was in the US during this time?
Yeah, well, there's and Dr. New talks about this to an extent in the curriculum as well, but, in the mid 19th century, some French artists encounter Japanese prints for the first time and they're like, what is this? Right? Like I have to, like this changes the way I think about, envisioning and creating images of the world that's new and fresh. And so that gets incorporated into, modern art in Europe. But I can't say if the collecting is quite the same. I don't know about the rise of the Japanese print collector in Europe. It certainly happens here in the United States. But there is, but there is absolutely interest and in the Japanese prints and among artists in particular. And influence, we see the works by Van Gogh, where he literally paints in his own way of oil painting, the works by Hiroshige. And then there, James McNeill Whistler, he's not creating a Japanese color woodcut, but the use of space and changes in his own etchings of bridges in London, right? So it's a bridge in London, but he takes on some of the spatial construction that he sees in Japanese prints, and he even starts kind of creating his own little like butterfly chop, kind of feels like it's referencing. It's not exactly like a Japanese print, but it's drawing on these things that they're seeing. But also just color wood cuts in European modern art, right? So German expressionists, for one, are creating color wood cuts, and they're not using Japanese colors per se, or the colors that they're seeing, or even the compositions, but there is kind of an interest in kind of is taking the right word, becoming inspired by, and kind of taking something they see and transforming it into something new.
Wow. Yeah. Oh, Teresa has raised her hand. Teresa, do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yeah, because this is kind of like a multi-layered question and it's coming from all angles. So I was just wondering, are there any other printmakers that you would find as comparable globally to some of these Japanese artists? Because I keep thinking of the lithographs made by Jose Guadalupe Posada, and that's like just very like political, in your face, like monochromatic oftentimes, and I also wonder about the political nature of Japanese prints, because I know when Matthew Perry showed up, they started printing like a lot of the Westerners' eyes like kind of blue in the whites, kind of show like that devilish aspect of these foreigners. And so is that more nuanced in Japanese printmaking as compared to Posada's work? And are there any parallel artists that you would recommend? Because I'm in New Mexico, so my kids are going to see Posada's work and they're going to be like, yeah, like I know that. Some of the Japanese prints, like they're going to recognize the wave. And so I'm just wondering if there's any like middle ground that I can have when I'm making my lesson plans on this.
Let me think about that for a moment. Certainly there are Japanese prints that are political, right? Because it's a popular form of image making and they're responding to current events, current social situations. I cannot say because I'm not entrenched in that culture, either as an original viewer, nor do I have the expertise in Japanese history or culture to really try to interpret that. But it's certainly present that there are statements being made, but as to the subtlety, that's what I'm trying to say. I can't speak to how subtle it is. I know there are instances where there's censorship, right? So you can't, like the government doesn't want certain types of images, and the artists find a way of not depicting the actual like person they're not supposed to, but they create a metaphor for it, right? So this is happening, but I can't say whether that would have been obvious or subtle, or how subtle or obvious it might have been to the original viewers. We do have, now these, I didn't share anything with you from our collection that wasn't owned by Frank Lloyd Wright or Edward Burr von Vleck's collection. But we do have some of those, we do have some prints in our collection that were made after the encounter with Matthew Perry. And so it is Japanese prints of Western people, or people from Europe in what they're seeing clothing that they perceive as Western, and also like Western buildings. So there's some of that, if that might be useful, just to kind of reverse that kind of like, here we're looking at Japanese culture, but here's kind of a flip of Japanese artists looking at what they're perceiving as Western culture and how they're dealing with it. Does that help? I know you're looking for a specific artist, but no? Okay, good.
I think that might also be a helpful question, Teresa, maybe to ask Kevin in our final session, and he might have some ideas. I also know if you're familiar with John Dower's book, War Without Mercy, in the early chapters of that book, he talks about Japanese depiction of especially Americans in early 20th century. I'm not sure whether any of the art he's working with is printmaking. I suspect some of it might be, but that might be another interesting place where there might be some leads there. But that's a really great question. Oh, Kathleen, is that a question? Yes, please unmute yourself.
Okay, I just have a few things. There's a strong tradition of First Nation printing, particularly in the Northwest. And the question that was asked earlier about getting blocks, they tend to be very protective of those blocks. The blocks are the family ownership, not, and I wonder how close that's tied. And then just as a website suggestion, there's a site called Black Ships and Samurai. I think it's through MIT. And it has prints from the Japanese press of what the Japanese artists thought when they heard the Americans had blue eyes, and the Americans' ideas of what was going on in Japan. And it's a really fascinating thing. So that was it. And sorry, I get it. It's kind of fascinating to kind of look at the art that I've been through and back. Black Ships and Samurai. And there's curriculum there as well, but it's really fascinating.
Great.
Thank
you for sharing that. I'm going to check that out myself.
All right. Thank you so much, James, for this presentation today. Thank you also to all of you who were able to join us live. This will be recorded and posted within 24 hours for all those people that couldn't make it. But this was a really, really great conversation, and I think really helped us understand the process and also gave us some good leads for where to look for some more information on this. So if we could give James a virtual round of applause for this session. And I know I am really looking forward to getting down to the Chazen when these things are on display. And everyone, I hope you will be able to join us next Monday at 4 p.m. for our final discussion with Dr. Kevin Newt. The first one, we really talked about Frank Lloyd Wright, the man. And the last one, we're going to kind of bring the two things together, and we're really going to talk about Japanese art in particular and its influence on his architecture. And we're also going to talk about issues of othering and a cultural appropriation, which I know many of you have asked questions about. So thank you very much for all of you who participated, and I look forward to seeing you next week.